Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Hope that everyone is safe and well and staying home during this very different time in our lives. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to be a part of this webinar about health and well-being require more than just self-care and nurturing intimate relationships with Dr. Tai Mendenhall. My name is Steve Davis, and I am the Director of Affinity Engagement with the University of Minnesota Alumni Association, and I will be your host for the day. First off, I would like to give a shout out and thanks to our members that make events like our webinar series possible. I want to thank you for your support. And also, if you have any questions and want to learn more information about the Alumni Association, please go to umnalumni.org. We have a few upcoming webinars that have been going on throughout the end of March and also going on throughout the rest of this month. Here are a few that are upcoming in the next week or so, but you can also find some of these webinars at umnalumni.org/virtual. Lastly, I wanted to give you a quick overview of Zoom. For those of you who have joined via your computer, you should be able to hear your audio. You can also join via phone by calling the 646 number and entering the webinar ID. There's also a one-click option in the email invite that you have gotten that will give you that access as well. There is a Q&A feature in this webinar. Feel free to throw in some of your questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation, where we will be talking more about those. So don't feel like you have to hold those. Just continue to add those to that list, and we will address those then. And also, for those of you who are joining and may have to jump off, please know that this is being recorded, and we will provide a video link as well as some of the slides after this is over so that you can have that. With that, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Tai Mendenhall. Tai Mendenhall is an associate professor in the University of Minnesota's Couple and Family Therapy program. Most students know him through his family and social science course called Intimate Relationships, which is oriented to young adults who are going through lots of transitions. He's not a stranger to many of our student struggles either. Tai completed his undergraduate degree at the University of Minnesota and ultimately came back after completing his doctorate and working as a faculty member at the U of M's medical school for several years. He has co-written and edited 5 books, 2 about medical family therapy, 3 about intimate relationships, alongside more than 100 journals and books and chapters, and is involved in a number of on-campus groups and supports students' personal and professional development. Welcome, Tai.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. Let me pull up my slide here. Let's see. Let me get to the right spot. Sorry, it did it like that. You just saw the whole thing backwards. Welcome everybody. I want to echo Steve's sentiment about you guys being safe and doing everything that you need to do to ensure that, and at the same time, not disengaging from life as we know it. And I know that a lot of folks are doing exactly that. And thank goodness we have the technology and the media that we do today versus even 10 years ago. And I think a lot of us are seeing that and feeling that as it relates to classes, as it relates to communicating and talking with family, other loved ones, friends, broadly defined, and certainly working from home. So as a setup for that, I know that the university had reached out and is offering a number of different webinars, and I was invited to talk about self-care really beyond the individual. And as Steve had said, related to the intimate relationships class and being a couple and family therapist and doing a lot of clinical work and teaching and research, because they all inform each other. This was not an easy, this was not an easy thing to say no to. I think that the connections between all of the different systems and all the different relationships that we inhabit are really important to think about, certainly beyond the individual, okay? And I think, though, as a setup, and I think that this is captured in the title that we put together for this webinar, is that health, well-being, resilience, self-care, etc., are not new things. I mean, certainly they've been in the media for a long time. They've been in professional resources as it relates to burnout and compassion fatigue prevention for a long time. And have gotten even more and more attention in mental health and in biomedical care, because our medical students and our residents and our graduate students are struggling with a lot of this stuff. But I don't think that you need to be in a professional role for this to be relevant. I think, though, that if you look at the bookstores, if you go into Barnes & Noble, if you go into Amazon, front and center, there's a lot of different resources that are out there as it relates to different ways that you can think, different ways that you can interpret, that you can perceive, that you can get yourself working on individual psychological, physical struggles, broadly defined. We know certainly as the internet has exploded, apps have certainly become more, accessible and easy, and really cool resources as it relates to the ability to get something on your phone and then you don't even need an internet connection, and being able to keep your feet to the fire and a lot of different things that are happening in your life and different ways that you can do this. All of these are good. Now, I, as one speaker, am not going to compare or contrast a lot of these resources other than to say that they do vary in terms of empirical support or whether or not a whole bunch of researchers that are out there are going to agree with what they say, but they're certainly available, okay? I think, though, that there's a couple of things to be careful about as we are critical consumers of this, and again, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but maybe to extend the focus, which again is what we're up to as it relates to this webinar. Most media outlets, as it relates to self-care, are deficit focused, okay? They presume that something is wrong, they presume that you're hurting, they presume that you need some kind of help, and you know what? That might be true, okay? That totally might be true. It might be related to depression, to anxiety, to wanting to lose weight, to wanting to, handle a work-life balance better. Might be about a variety of different things in terms of your own individual self and function in relation to fill in the blank. Of course, they're there, okay? But they change a lot, and that's why they've never been able to find one that sticks, okay? They're generally framed as like, if you read this book or do this app, everything will be okay, right? And they have all these people that, testimonials like, my life has changed. As soon as I got this, everything got better. I lost 50 pounds in a day, and, my depression went away by dinner time, and I'm not sure that a lot of the claims are realistic. They're usually presented by very charismatic leaders, by people that have, in different ways and shapes and forms, been there, done that, so they are able to effectively sell products, right? And a lot of this is business. And again, some of them are good, some of them are empirically supported. But I think if we think about what's missing with a lot of this stuff is this individualistic frame that they are positioned in is not attending to the dynamic ways that resilience occurs for most of us, and the complex ways that this stuff is actually relational in the ways that it goes, okay? And what does that mean? I think if we go into it further, we start to think then that, okay, if it's not about being tough, if it's not about being strong, if it's not about, gaining different types of skills to be impervious to fill in the blank, okay? We're starting to recognize that this is an interactive phenomenon that is super dynamic in the ways that it happens. That honestly, some of the most resilient people have completely fallen apart, and they might have done that by lunchtime, right? That being weak is just as important as being strong. That being vulnerable and being able to communicate that vulnerability is just as important as being able to hold it together through something, okay? And, we know in different facets or different parts of mental health that this is not new information either. If you look, for example, at Alcoholics Anonymous, and literature around sobriety, you know, sobriety is not being dry. You know, I'm dry, I haven't drank for 6 months, because dry means that as soon as there's, like, if you think about like a dry twig, I mean, as soon as there's pressure put on it, it's gonna snap, you know, and that resilience is actually about the ability to bend and the ability to handle and to do and to respond to things and to have bad days, right? But to be able to pull through and to adapt to those bad days instead of being like this rock that's infallible to stress, okay? And as it relates to the systemic or the interactive stuff, is that we don't do this in a vacuum. That most of us are either in or want to be in intimate relationships, and actually the context of those relationships is essential to all of the systems that are connected to us, that either create us or that we create. And if you look at the different systems that create us or that we create, they're all connected, okay? And maybe this is an easier way to see it, that we have our physiology, of course, that we have our psychology, and people and different cultures over time have thought or have perceived or have experienced anything that's above the neck is no longer physiological, right? That if you're struggling with depression or anxiety, for example, it's not a matter of serotonin, norepinephrine, or dopamine in the brain, which it is, okay? But it's a matter of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. You know, if you get diabetes, you can't look down at your pancreas and say, come on, pancreas, kick it in and make some more, like, you know, insulin. But you know, if your brain is deficit in serotonin, we do that, you know, and we might as well like look in the mirror and say, come on, brain, make some more serotonin. It's not working like that, right? I mean, these things are certainly connected, and what's going on then in our psychology affects our behavior, okay, of course. And as we get into that behavior, where is that behavior happening? Well, it's happening in our relationships. And if we go into, or if we start into the couple and the family unions that we inhabit, okay, there's a lot of different literature, a lot of other books that talk about, you know, how do you communicate with people, you know, what does this look like, etc. But they're not usually framed as self-help. And oftentimes, as it relates to self-care, in framing up how do we handle stress, okay, this gets missed because we go straight to the self-help books, which are individual. Okay, and what we're missing here is that the couple and family systems that we inhabit actually connect all the systems. Okay, conceptually, they're in the middle of that system's continua, of course, and so it's easy if we start there to be able to go into the smaller systems and to go into the larger systems. If we start in either end, it's harder. And we see that as it relates to a lot of disciplinary fields being able to talk to each other. We see that as it relates to a lot of the different literature and the different books that we try to connect the dots with. And so ultimately, a lot of times we don't. Professionally, we see a lot of turf battles across different disciplines that struggle to talk with each other. And as a consumer of different literature or different things, we oftentimes isolate these different systems, right? These couple, family, to the psychology, to the biological, and then back up again, okay, as individual or separatable things, and they don't function that way, okay? So as we're looking at those intimate relationships that we inhabit, we're not ignoring the other systems, but we're honoring the system that's in the middle of that continuum. And that's one of the biggest things, and I'll conclude here today on really kind of the in sum or conclusion of a lot of research that shows that there's benefit and wisdom to doing this. It's not just kind of a warm and fuzzy feel-good thing with couples, okay? And so as we start to grow in our intimate relationships and everything and all the different ways that looks at, this isn't a new idea. And this is a fun thing or a fun sequence of different images that my students and I look at, and actually it wasn't me that found this, it was one of my students no, I can't read it, but different attention or paying attention to the ways that we do relationships effectively or well is not a new idea. I mean, we've been trying to do this for a long time. How do we get along with each other, right? And certainly the different ways that love has been defined, the different ways that hierarchies across different generations of relationships, even now, certainly varies across cultures and different groups. But the attention and the regard to doing this well has stayed, and it continues to stay. And I don't care where you look in time or where you look in place or culture or religion or ethnicity or faith, it's all there, okay? but oftentimes it's taken for granted, or it's kind of poo-pooed as something that's a little bit more warm and fuzzy. Let's focus down on the individual. We know that in the 40s, family science, family therapy started to come into their own as a recognized field. And ironically, it was created by individually trained folks, you know, psychiatry, psychology, for example, which in a stereotypical way, more focus on one person at a time, actually started to connect those systems. Into the 80s and 90s, we started to see a lot more research and literature that started to get to the lay public that was empirically supported. These are different examples of that. And then getting into more of the couple within the family union, and then how we ultimately then do that in the context of our social relationships. We can find those books. A lot of folks have heard of Leo Biscaglia, for example, you know, certainly, and then textbooks like Extraordinary Togetherness, John Gottman's work, who we're going to come back to here in a little bit, where we can observe couples and be able to predict over 90% accuracy whether or not they're going to stay together or divorce if nothing else happens along the way. I mean, that's some pretty compelling stuff. And I think that then as we situate the couples within those families and intimate unions, we're starting to see a lot more work that is, again, more available, but when or how it hits people's radars is another thing. And so when we go back to that question, what's missing and how do we do self-care in the context of our relationships, we need to dive into the complexity, because just recognizing that it's something that's got a lot of moving parts, yes, that's a good thing. But then when we go into all that literature that I just said, I mean, these are just different examples of what's in those books. And I don't present this, and this is certainly an incomplete list, to overwhelm anybody, other than to say this is what makes up the relationships that we are in such gorgeous parts of our lives. I mean, the complexity, the depth, the unions that we experience in our marriages, in our boyfriends, girlfriends, boyfriends, and then certainly moving on from that into a variety of different family relationships, are the unions that we inhabit that absolutely can be the most high highs that we experience as humans, and the most low lows. And so we need to do them on purpose instead of passively. How do we do that? I think all the time, because when we look at building and growing in intimacy, I think that there's a lot of attention to couples that are in courtship and maybe couples that are in trouble, but we need to be doing it all the time. We need to honestly be doing it all the time. And I think that as we look at the ways that we can maintain, the ways that we can constantly build, and I don't care if you've been married for a year or if you've been married for 50 years, couples that maintain and couples that prioritize and do those relationships on purpose are couples that are always growing. And I'll tell you, you know, I'm 49 years old. I feel like I'm just getting warmed up, and you know, and I look at my own parents or my grandparents and other older couples that are inspiring to me, just because I'm, you know, I don't know, middle-aged at this point. That's humbling to say it that way, but doesn't mean that I've figured anything out yet. I think that wherever we are, we're just getting started. And couples that maintain that kind of, I think, perspective are truly learning and growing and figuring each other out. And I don't care how long they've been together. And it's so fun as you look at and you see couples do this. And my call then is be a couple that does this. You know, be a parent that does this with your kids, and your child doesn't have to be, you know, 6 years old or 60 years old to do it. You can do it. And there's a variety of different ways that you can do it. Focusing more on couples, because we don't have, like, you know, a whole semester to talk today. A lot of then, you know, my students or older folks and anybody in between will say, well, how do we get started? I think that a lot of the work that's out there by John Gottman and his team, and I put down there on the bottom, you see any books or articles by him and his team, are really good places to start and to be looking at some of this, okay? The house metaphor is, I think, something that starts to answer that question, because oftentimes we kind of do relationships in a reactive way instead of a proactive way. We don't do our relationships on purpose. We just kind of try to figure them out. But, you know, can you imagine like building a house that way? You know, like if you and I don't know, some of your friends, you know, we're looking at like an empty lot and say, let's build a house, and one of you is digging a hole and the other one's picking out wallpaper or furniture. I mean, you're probably not going to have such a good outcome, right? And if you think about building a house, and you know, I've never built a house, you know, I've done certainly home remodeling projects, but I think you can still follow the metaphor without having actually done this yourself, is that you create a foundation first. I mean, you must have a foundation before you build up, right? You got to build up the scaffolding after that. You can't be, you know, running plumbing and electric until you have the scaffolding up, until you have the rooms, you know, kind of, you know, mapped out. You got to have that before you can put up the drywall. You got to do the, you know, floor before you put the trim. You can't put the trim on, you know, before you know, lay down the tile. I mean, there's a different kind of sequence or different choices that you might have along the way, like, you know, what color is the tile, but you still need to put down the tile before you put down the trim. And as you're looking at different houses, or if you're looking at different relationships with a house kind of metaphor, a lot of Gottman's work and others within that team frame, and you can see this is a big house. I mean, there's, you know, most of us don't live in houses with that many floors, but the metaphor still works, right? And the problem here, as we start with the foundation, okay, the most important thing in relationships, and again, I don't care how long you've been together, is the foundation. Most of us don't spend very long on this. And this is one of the problems, and certainly as it connects to this context that we're currently living in, I think that there's some opportunities here, okay? In courtship, couples do this. When couples meet each other and they start to date, they're building what we call love maps, which is an academic and very unromantic term. But basically it's learning about each other's worlds, about each other's hopes, goals, dreams, friends, family, you know, your favorite songs, worries, fears. I mean, this is first date, second date, third date kind of stuff, which is usually when young couples will say that they're experiencing a spark, right? It's really exciting. They're you know, waiting, you know, every minute, you know, for a text to come back, or if you're an older couple to see each other again, or to get that phone call and hope that, you know, somebody's not on the phone, because then they're going to get a busy signal or whatever it is. And then what's so sad, and I hear this over and over again, is that people will actually frame or narrate the spark running out or the spark burning out as normal and okay, right? It's so commonly felt to only really be excited about your relationship in the early phases because, quote unquote, real life happens, because then you have to deal with bills and you have to deal with kids and you have all this stuff. And it's easy as an older couple to look down your nose at a younger couple and say, oh, they're fun now, they're excited now, but they don't know what real love is yet. They haven't stood the test of time. I think that certainly the initial excitements, and we have some research that shows this, of, you know, a brand new relationship are not going to feel the same over time. But why should you ever stop courtship? And a lot of our research says don't. Okay, and that, you know, as it relates to this, you know, I would say, you know, learning about each other is something that you can always be doing right now. You know, as long as you're quarantined, sit on the couch. So, you know, talk with each other about this stuff. You know, questions about your past, present, spirituality, what ifs, dilemmas. And a lot of people are looking at this and thinking, well, how? What do I ask? You know, don't I know about her past? I know everything. I doubt it. And so here's some resources. Here's some ideas, you know, and I'll tell you, because, you know, I teach this and because I do a lot of this stuff, you know, this is a very incomplete list of books. I have all of these. And I'll tell you, they are so much fun on a road trip to bring in the car, to sit on the couch at night and just, you know, close your eyes and open up the book on different questions, to talk with each other. And again, I don't care if you've been together for a short amount of time or a long amount of time, you will learn more. Okay, and you know, the questions, you know, as it relates to here, and I have just different examples of them, like the past, you know, what was your first day at school like? You know, when did you learn how to, you know, ride a bike or swim? What was your favorite pet's name as like a child? What was your favorite pet? You know, ours was Pyewacket. She was the sweetest cat ever. You know, and I have a lot of stories about that. And my wife, Ling, knows all about Pyewacket. You know, your favorite teacher, you know, my 5th grade teacher, Miss Little, you know, hands down. And Ling, my wife, knows all about Miss Ling, she, you know, or Miss Little. You know, my favorite books as a child, you know, your favorite holidays, you know, your present, you know, who's your favorite movie star, you know, your favorite song, you know, if you could write a letter to yourself as a child, knowing what you know now, what would you say, you know? What do you daydream about? What makes you nostalgic, you know? Spirituality, you know, how do you define the difference between spirituality and religion? If you could name one thing about your religion that you have troubles with, what would it be? If you could ask God one question, what would it be? You know, talk about this stuff. And, you know, the what ifs, like, you know, if you could go back into any time in your life, you know, what would that time be? You know, dilemmas, like if you found a $10 bill on the street, would you be happy or would you feel guilty? What about if it was a $100 bill, you know, where's the cutoff? You know, love and sex, you know, what are you excited about? You know, what kind of fantasies do you have? Talk about this stuff. And, you know, I'll tell you, you know, just like recently, like a week ago, my wife and I sat down on the couch, and of course, you know, one of the dangers of teaching this stuff is that she's always hearing about this stuff. And I said, hey, let's look at one of the books of questions. And I was thinking, okay, we'll go through, you know, I don't know, half a dozen questions before bed. We only got through one question and we talked for like a couple of hours, and it was really cool. You know, we've been together for a long time. I mean, so why not? And I'll tell you, you don't know everything about your partner. And, you know, I don't care, again, how long you've been together. There's always more to learn. And this is so cool to do. And I think that if you're in a good place in your relationship, if you're feeling more disconnected because you've been focused on other things, or maybe not balancing work and family life very well, do it. It doesn't matter. I think that anywhere you start, there you are. And I guarantee you will never have time to get through all these books, okay? What's happening then, and what's happening there, is that you're starting to, again, with the house, and continuing to, because just like you have a nice foundation, yeah, now you can build up, but you're also needing to maintain that foundation, and that's why you should always doing it, is that you're developing this sense of teamwork and mutual influence. Just like team members, you know, all have different roles and they work together, you need to allow your partner to influence you, and back, right? And you know, my way is the highway is no way to have a good relationship, of course. But the ways that you figure things out together, which I'll get to here in another slide or two, are not necessarily hard work. I don't know if they have to be. I mean, sometimes they can be hard work, but they can be so enriching and so connecting for couples to do. And as it relates all the way back to that continuum that we're going to, you know, I'll share different reasons why that's good, okay? Managing conflict as you build the house, you know, because usually couples right at the beginning don't have a whole lot of conflict, or they haven't been together long enough to have a whole lot of conflict about a whole lot of different things. You know, maybe they do, but it's a comparatively short list, of course, okay? But I think that it's important as you go through here, and because you're developing that positive perspective, that culture of appreciation and love for each other all the time, as you're asking each other questions, as you're figuring out problems together, I think it's important to remember that arguments tend to end in the way that they start, okay? So if you've been saying things like fine when you're not fine, or that nothing's wrong when something's wrong, you've been building up and all of a sudden, kaboom, you know, and you start yelling, or you just snap, or you biting each other's heads off, you know, chances are that's not going to turn out super great. You know, not with the music playing and the credits rolling up like they do in the movies and everything's okay. I mean, not in real life, okay? And so if you're starting your arguments, you know, respectfully, and you're talking about behavior instead of character, right? So, I mean, there's a difference, for example, between, you know, geez, it bothers me that, you know, you're leaving all the dirty dishes in the sink. And I know that we're at home, you know, all day right now in the quarantine, and we're going through more dishes, but, you know I'm kind of a neat freak, and it would mean a lot to me if you could put them in the dishwasher instead. Great. Okay, I can put them in the dishwasher. That's a behavior. Or you can, you know, not say anything for a week and then all of a sudden explode and you're such a freaking slob and you don't care about me, and you know I'm a neat freak, and you know, how do you live in this kind of mess? Well, you know, now you've attacked my character instead of something that's easy, like putting the dishes in the dishwasher, and it's never going to go as well, because that, you know, is going to, you know, I'm not going to say, oh, you're right, I'm such a slob. I'm probably going to defend myself, you know, and then we just go back and forth and cross complaining, and we start doing what's called kitchen sinking. And now, because we haven't been talking, there's 10 things that we're arguing about. We have no idea how to finish this argument. We have no idea how to resolve it, because we're all over the map, you know, from 0 to 100 in, you know, 2 seconds. I think that along the way, though, and you know, again, if we had all day, I could talk about a lot of different ways that couples learn and manage conflict. But the point is that we have to, right? And certainly in this context, if we're living with each other 24/7, it's I think in some regards it's even more important, but it's also even more likely that there might be conflict to have. Okay, the win-win option, though, you know, just like I had said, a lot of people just presume that things get kind of, you know, I don't know, boring or lame after the first, you know, honeymoon phase of a relationship. That's not necessarily true, or maybe even shouldn't be true. I think that a lot of times people, as they look at their relationships, presume that in the context of conflict, that compromise is the goal, right? And I would tell you that compromise should be maybe your second choice, because compromise is, by definition, kind of a lose-lose. It means that it kind of sucks for both of us, but because it sucks for you and it sucks for me, maybe it's okay. I do think that's better than win-lose, of course, but why not go for the win-win? And there's some reasons that I think couples struggle with this win-win. First, because it doesn't compute. I mean, they're presuming that the best thing is lose-lose. But I think that the other reason is because of some human tendencies, and psychology can speak to this, I think, quite well, of the ways that if we're not consciously trying to create solutions, we can actually derail our unions in our marriages, in our, well, in any two-person type of conflict. If we don't do it consciously, there's some pretty predictable patterns that can get in the way. Okay, and so when we're looking at win-win or compromise, again, because that's the first two, I think that we need to look for win-win first. Okay, and really what's happening here, I think, is to remember that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. I think that's probably the first thing to think about. And I think that if you, and in couples, I would encourage all of them to look at and to think about this really carefully. If you're in some kind of conflict with each other and your partner is talking, are you thinking about what you're going to say when they're done talking? Okay, or are you listening to what they're saying? Okay, and I would challenge you to really reflect hard about that, because a lot of times we're just thinking about what we're going to say when our partner is done talking. Okay, and I'll tell you, if that's what you're doing, it's probably not going to work so well. Okay, and vice versa, of course. Okay, but then getting at the multiple solutions, this is what I was talking about in terms of a human tendency that can get in the way of our problem solving. So I want you to do this just as an example. You see, you thought you were going to just be able to watch this webinar. I'm actually going to give you something to do. But I seriously want you to do this. Get a piece of paper. You're going to do this real quick with me here, okay? Complete this task now. And my hope is that it's not super difficult, but this is what I want you to do, okay? I want you to divide 13 and a half and write your answer down. I'll give you a second for that. I'm going to take a drink of water. Okay, so now my presumption is that you have done the task. I want, you know, obviously I can't interact with you in the same way maybe that I would if we were in the room or in a, you know, voice conversation on the phone or a FaceTime conversation. But if your answer here is 6.5, you are among friends. I think a lot of people answer it that way. And then now imagine like you and your partner are in disagreement about what the answer to this question is. And you're thinking, what's wrong with you? It's 6.5. Isn't that obvious that it's the answer? And you are going to fight and argue and carry on and try to convince them, win, lose, that the answer is 6.5 because it's so clear to you that that is what is correct, okay? Apply this to anything, okay? But is that the only answer? And, you know, I talked about my wife, Ling. She and I, she's a third grade teacher, and she and I have talked a lot about this. It's amazing to me how young people, when you present them with tasks, are actually quite creative in solving them, but then we beat the creativity out of them as they grow older and older. And by the time they graduate high school or get into college, there's no more creativity. They just know the answer is A, B, C, or D. You know, and that's a whole nother tangent that I won't go on too much. But I would argue that there's more than one answer to my question. Why not this? Is that not potentially an answer to dividing 13.5? So what if you think it's 6.5 and your partner thinks it's 1,3? Who's right? You know, what about this one? Why not go into Roman numerals? I mean, there's nothing right or wrong about looking at it this way, is there? You know, or how about we go that way? That's actually that's actually, I think, the more formally approved way of doing that in Roman numerals. What about this? Let's go sideways through it. Isn't that potentially an answer? And how about this one? I mean, actually, the task is a word question. I didn't ever give you the question in a numerical form. Your brain went to do that maybe, but you know, it is a word question. I say divide THIRTEEN in half. Well, you know, it's 4 letters each, right? It is in half. Why not that answer? And I think that what we're getting here, and this is what I was talking about as it relates to what can derail us sometimes in conflict, is that the human brain tends to think in twos, right or wrong, black or white, foreign or domestic, my way or your way, okay? And then as soon as we have that, we stop thinking. We do, we just completely stop thinking. And then we hunker down and we defend our answer. And I'll tell you, if you say it's 6.5 and your partner says it's THIR, TEEN, I don't know. I mean, maybe you can compromise and have it be 6.teen. I don't, you know, that seems kind of crazy, but maybe that's a lose-lose and it kind of sucks for you because that's not really my answer, and kind of sucks for you because that's not really your answer, but at least we compromise. I'm not sure that's the best way, you know, because there's a lot of ways. And, you know, arguably any of these answers is right, right? And so why don't we keep looking and remember and really embrace, really, that there's a whole bunch of different answers most of the time when we're in conflict. And I'll tell you, as a clinician, when I work with couples, a lot of times it's not like we're, you know, beating somebody's defenses down that's being unrealistic and you know, having everybody join the correct side. I think actually quite uncommonly is that the case. It's just that we need to keep working to figure out something that, you know, ultimately can be a win-win. And you know, there's a lot of examples of this. Some of them are really deep and would take a long time to explain, and some are actually quite simple. I mean, I remember, you know, having a couple that was arguing over, you know, where to squeeze the toothpaste to. You know, one of them was like, you know, she's driving me crazy. She's squeezing it in the middle. God, I can't stand that. You know, and obviously that one partner A's, you know, correct answer was squeeze it at the end, you know, and then move your way up. And partner B was like, squeeze it in the middle, you know, who cares? Both of those are arguably right, but, you know, neither one of them is necessarily going to agree. And how do you compromise on that? So, well, why not get 2 toothpaste tubes? There's a third answer. Why not get a toothpaste pump? You know, pump. there's another answer, keep looking. I had a couple not too long ago that had just moved in together, and they were super excited, and they got in this really crazy argument because one of them wanted to hang the dish towel on the handle on the refrigerator, and the other wanted to hang the dish towel over by the sink, and they were arguing about this. And I looked at them and I'm like, well, can't you just hang 2 dish towels? Heck, you got all kinds of dish towels then. Wherever you are, there's one that's easy access. You could put one on the fridge and you could put one on the sink. And they both kind of looked at each other and they're like, does that sound okay to you? Yeah, that's problem solved. Don't stop at 2 answers. If neither one of you like the 2 answers, keep looking, keep figuring out. And what happens then is that you guys as a couple, instead of going against each other, are co-creating something that neither one of you had thought about yet. And I think that if you have that couple context or couple culture of appreciation, and maybe even the night before you were going through books of questions, that there's this genuine just kind of regard for each other that opens yourself up to that more than in comparison when you're just ready to roll with some kind of argument. Okay? And I think that there's a lot of things to say about the ways that we communicate, but as I'm conscious of time, let me just really roll or conclude with a couple of things here. Okay, communicating all the time versus when there's a problem is one of the biggest things that I think you can do as it relates to the self-care, maintenance, well-being, and resilience of your relationship. Because so often we only think about it when there's a problem. Couples will meet, they do courtship, it's really exciting, and then they say, oh, kind of, normal to lose our spark, and then all of a sudden, there's a problem down the road, and they're like, no, honey, we got to communicate. Give me some I statements. And they haven't been communicating along the way, and so it's a really steep learning curve or a big ask. And I will never forget. I mean, some of my students a couple of years ago were saying, well, what about I love you? And I'm like, well, what do you mean I love you? And they're like, well, early in a relationship, we say that all the time. It's really exciting. We say it in the middle of dinner and do all this stuff. And then later on, it becomes kind of rote. You say it when you say goodbye on the telephone. You say it, when you write, in the birthday card. But that's kind of when you're supposed to say it. It really doesn't land in this. And you know what? They're right. And there's a whole bunch of example stories that I could, share about how as couples reclaim this, it doesn't lose its meaning. And then people say, oh, she knows that. No, she doesn't, not in the same way every single day in the different ways that it can come out. And I remember I was working with a couple not too long ago, an elderly couple, and they were really kind of struggling with some end of life stuff as they're kind of in the twilight of their years. And the man, it was a heterosexual couple, kind of true to his generation and all the stereotypes of the strong stoic man, didn't really talk much. And they were starting to do this. They were starting to go on dates again, which is super important, and all these different things that can be a maintenance idea for relationships. And they were out and about, and all of a sudden she's walking by herself, and she's like, oh my God, where did he go? And he's just stopped, like on the sidewalk or the hallway or wherever they were, about 10 feet back, and he's just looking at her. And she's like walking up to him, and she's like, are you okay? And he's like 75 years old, and he's just looking at her, and he says, my life is truly blessed because you're in it. And, oh my God, I love you with all of my heart. And I know I don't say that enough, but you know what, I'm going to start. And then he just started walking, and then she's sitting there like, oh my goodness, where did that come from? And how beautiful and amazing that was for her. Instead of just really being vulnerable or talking or sharing, kind of your perspectives when there's something to work out. But no, he's just out and about with his wife, like for 50 years, and just wanted to say that. Why not? And when or as we communicate in that way, certainly we will have conflict and there'll be problems, but we're going to be better able to do it because we're talking all the time. And it's amazing to me how much more difficult it is sometimes for people to communicate love or regard or affection or appreciation than it is to yell at each other about where to hang the dish towel or to put dishes in the sink, from the sink to the dishwasher, whatever. Those are little things, why not talk about what what really matters, and to make that part of your daily, dialogue. And we do that, in a lot of ways that we would frame or see as kind of common sense. And these are listed here, but I'll end on just a couple of quick things here before we open up to questions. And that is, one is to be really careful about unconditional love. I use the giving tree as a great example. My students will talk about or write about this story, which, and most of us are familiar with it, and I don't have time to retell it here. But I don't think that this is a very healthy relationship, because it's a very one-way relationship with somebody that's very capable of reciprocating. And the idea of conditional love versus unconditional love, I think, gets debated a lot, because unconditional love is oftentimes romanticized as the best kind. I think it's great between parents and very young children. I think it's very appropriate between somebody maybe that's declining in chronic illness or dementia. But I think outside of those types of exceptions, most of the time, a reciprocal relationship where we both show up and we both have responsibility and accountability to the union and to each other is a lot more healthy. And I think that as we do that, and when we do all of these things, we have relationships that don't operate at the expense of the self or vice versa. And what's really, I think, compelling, and there's more and more research for this, remember that continuum that I showed, is because most of us are either in or want to be in relationships, and that the social function of those relationships are the haven and the foundation in which and from which we interact with the world, is that across the biology, the physical health, and all the different things that means, across the psychology, the mental health, and all the things that means, all the way up into our social and even spiritual health. When we do those relationships well, pick your dependent variable. It doesn't matter what it is. It's invariably better. It's invariably stronger, okay? And the outcomes in that dynamic way that we experience resilience, that ability to be strong and weak, that ability to be tough and to be vulnerable, is invariably better, okay? And so remember, this stuff is systemic and relational. Of course, those books, those apps, do them. A lot of them, figure them out, shop them around. But then look at the stuff that's about the couples too. Look at the stuff that's about the families too. This is our team, this is our people, this is our group. And as we go forward, really in general, and certainly in the context and the crazy kind of experiences that we're going through right now, this is your group, this is your foundation, and do it well and do it on purpose, because we really are all in this together. And I think that if you look across and see your spouse, your loved one, as a teammate versus somebody to argue with, obviously any and all of these different things across the systems are going to be felt and experienced in different ways. Okay, so I'm looking at my time. I sure appreciate you guys hanging out with me, listening to me. I know Steve's going to kind of consolidate some of our questions, but that is in a very quick sense a whole bunch of information that we know about couples, about families, intimate relationships in a very short amount of time, and I sure appreciate you listening.
Thank you, Tai. This was amazing. I think just going through this myself, taking notes and thinking about, that we're at this time and we're in the house together with our partners. This is the perfect time to turn off all the distractions and Netflix and talk. This is a perfect, end note on that. I want to encourage everyone, if you have questions, to start submitting those through the Q&A at this point. But we'll kick off the first question to you, Tai. What are some tips in regard of relationships where one partner is at home because they have to work from home and the other is an essential employee, so they have to go to work? What are some tips on how that relationship can kind of balance and support one another?
Well, I think that's a great question. It's certainly common. I mean, I'm clinically situated at the medical school and have been going back and forth as it relates to some of that work myself, and so I can relate. But I'll tell you, I also really appreciate the folks that are working at the grocery store, for example, where I'm stopping and helping to do what I need to do to take care of Ling and I along the way. So this is real and this is felt. My first answer was do it very collaboratively, openly, and transparently about what you're worried about. Okay. A lot of times when I work with people, you know, well, if I don't ask, we could spend our entire time together talking about something that's a little bit less important than what they really want to talk about. So even asking the question, what are you the most worried about? What are you the most afraid of? What's going on for you? You know, and it's that, you know, I'm afraid when you come home that you're going to bring in the virus. I'm afraid when you go to work that, you know, you're not safe, or, you know, whatever it is, and then collaboratively figure out some kind of plan. I know a lot of families, couples, for example, you know, they have an entryway, and that as soon as you walk back in the house, you're literally getting naked in the entryway and walking back into the house, and you're going straight into the shower. When somebody goes out and gets stuff, they have like a dirty part and a clean part on like a table, and then they work as a couple to literally wash everything that goes back and forth. That even if they say don't wear masks, or the people are wearing masks, if anything, just because my partner is worried about it and I'm going to do it. If this is some of the mutual influence too. I mean, don't get into an argument about whether or not you should do something. If it's important to your partner, do it, because, you know, if something's important to you and your partner doesn't think so, then, you know, hopefully they'll do that as well. I think that along the way, there's a lot of different alternatives, ways that employers are figuring out to be responsive to that too. I know, you know, for example, even my clinical work looks different right now than it did 3 days ago. And so these conversations need to be consistent. And once you get them figured out, that doesn't mean, you know, you don't have something new to talk about the next day as well. But do it together, and don't have one person kind of lead the show. I mean, if you do it that way, it's not going to work. You might do something, but somebody's missing out or not feeling good about how it went.
Great. There's a lot of questions coming in about communication. And when you mention communicate all the time as a better way of approaching it rather than just when a problem occurs, what are some tips in regards to, you know, exercising that muscle, but also having a good productive conversation when you have opposite points of views and can't see that third or fourth option? What are your ideas in that?
Oh, I think that's a great question. I think my first answer was to say there is no panacea. I mean, in honesty, I mean, a lot of this is going to depend on the dispositions of the two people in the couple and the contexts that they came from. I mean, you know, as it relates to culture, ethnicity, gender, hierarchy, power, there's a lot of different things that can influence how that goes. I think the wisdom of communicating all the time is a wisdom that a lot of people disconnect with because they just don't do it. Outside of courtship, they stop communicating all the time, and then it's more about what's for dinner, who's going to cart which kid off to which activity, or, you know, it's, you know, nighttime, what movie do you want to watch? I don't know, honey. What do you want to watch? I don't know, honey. You want to, you know, and really it's not a substantive conversation. I think that going from nothing to something substantive is a big leap for a lot of couples. And that's why those books of questions or different kind of lighter topics are ways to ease into some of this. And if you have different, you know, instead of saying, hi, honey, how was your day? Which is a really flat question, you know, oh, it was fine, you know, and we always call fine the F word because it stands for effed up, insecure, neurotic, and emotionally unstable. It's a completely dishonest word. You know, tell me about your day. What was going on with your day? You know, and then remember what was going on with their day yesterday. How did that go today? Because I know you were dealing with that. You know, and vice versa. You know, just like with your kid, how was school today? No, you know, how did that test go? Because you paid attention and you knew. You know, what was going on, you know, with X, Y, and Z project, you know. Those types of questions are deeper and they connect better. And if you're doing those types of things all the time, first of all, you're going to have less things to fight about. But then when you do have something that you have conflict about, you're better able to have the conflict, because you're not going from what's for dinner tonight, what TV show do you want to watch, to something that's really important. I think that there's a lot of different types of resources that I could certainly offer if you want to have folks, ask. I have a lot of different worksheets, a lot of different kind of exercises, certainly a lot of different things that could land with different couples. Because we teach this, and because I work with a lot of folks clinically, I have a number of resources that kind of serve as a buffet that people could look at and pick and choose what really seems to stick or resonate with them in a more specific way than what I just said. But don't go from 0 to 100 with nothing in the middle, and try to figure out different ways to ease into it, and give yourself the room and the time potentially to do it. It's a process. It's not an event.
Great. There's a question in regards to domestic violence and how that kind of plays sometimes in relationships, and how do you actually have a conversation, a healthy relationship when physical abuse is present, but also having that conversation across different cultures to kind of bring that point home.
Well, that I think in a lot of regards would be an entirely other webinar to do justice to. That is a complex thing. I think that for example, even now in the quarantine situation, we're seeing a lot of different paths that couples are going in. Some couples are just rallying around this and becoming more close because they're not stuck at home, they're safe at home, right? It's a different perspective, and they're doing maybe different things to unite as a couple. And other couples are really struggling, and certainly as it relates to domestic violence, now you're in a situation that you're potentially not safe and you're not supposed to go anywhere. Oh my goodness, I mean, that is a horrible set of circumstances. And I think that the question, how do you communicate in the context of domestic violence? I mean, that's tough, because what might be and likely is more important in that context is to ensure safety. I think clinical work to resolve that, or to do better as a couple is, I talked about a process versus an event. That's definitely a process, and figuring out different ways to do that safely and to do that along the way are really kind of outside of the scope of building intimacy per se, because there's a lot of rebuilding and new skill learning to do. So, and I do have a lot of resources either to connect with for further information or support, and or to be looking at as well as it relates to domestic violence. But again, I just want to honor that it's a little bit more complex to really do well in the time that we have right now. But I would encourage whoever asked that question to connect with me. I have my information here, and I know that Steve, you're a conduit or a connection there as well. But why don't you connect with me and we can go further?
Thanks, Ty, for that. In closing, let's go with one last question. A lot of these questions are coming in around the same theme of you're talking about resources. So what are some good books, resources, activities for date nights, things that people can do while we're quarantined to continue to have that courtship, but also learn how to navigate our conflict? Any tips and pointers on activities and things that people can do in that?
I think that is a great question. I love that. So off the top of my head, and again, I know that these slides are going to be available for folks, correct, Steve?
Yes.
The books of questions, and 1,000 of them, order them, get them on Amazon. There's a whole bunch of resources that I can share that are fun activities, like where couples go apart and they're like, things that I love about you that you know, things that I love about you that you don't know. And they do that for a few days and they don't talk about it, and then they come together and they share each other their answers, and sometimes they're not surprised and other times they're floored. They're like, oh my goodness, really? You love how I like sing to the cats. You love how I like go through my whole shoe process every time I'm trying to get out the door. That's cool to you. And it's like, oh my goodness, you know, and couples never knew this stuff. And so, I mean, those are fun exercises. I think that right now in the quarantine situation, I mean, because people are obviously home quite a bit more, this can be a really fun time to dive into stuff that, you know, maybe you've had on the back burner for a year or for 10 years. Like, you know, dig the guitar out of the attic and learn how to play that. And the partner has the keyboard and you guys are learning kind of songs together. Or, you know, open up the big boxes of, you know, photo albums or all of your pictures that are like crazily disorganized, and, you know, go through those together. You know, clean the garage. You know, it's amazing to me. I actually heard something not too long ago about how full the recycle bins are now because people are going through their stuff, and do that together, kind of make it a fun project. You know, I think that as it relates to other types of books, is beyond what we had said, there's a couple of workbooks for couples, and again, it's not that you're in trouble. I mean, couples can be in trouble or they can be in great shape and they're still benefiting from this stuff. Workbooks, daily activities, different things like that, I could certainly connect you with. Those can be a blast for couples as they're looking. I think if you're going a little bit deeper, there's a dynamite book called Attached. That's just the title, Attached, and it's got a big heart on it. It's co-written by a physician and a social work therapist, a therapist who was originally trained in social work. Extraordinary book, and it's a quick read. I think that as it relates to other stuff, if couples are more wanting to look at different patterns that could be problematic for them, The Dance of Intimacy, that was one of the other books that I talked about, you know, that looks at patterns on couples that pursue in distance, couples that overfunction and underfunction, couples that tend to dominate versus being submissive with each other, couples that are really positive versus negative, you know, who's always trying to cheer each other up and who's always trying to be, you know, cheered up, you know. The Dance of Intimacy and anything by Harriet Lerner that deals with that can be really fun, because once you've identified different patterns and you've named them, and clinically we call that making the covert overt, then a lot of times couples can get to work. And again, you don't have to be in conflict to get to work. I mean, you can always be getting better. So, I mean, off the top of my head, those would be some ideas I would throw out. But again, send folks my way, or I can make different resources available. They can be so much fun and so engaging and so enriching for couples, young or old, to be able to do that work.
Well, thank you very much for all of that insight and all the information. Apologies for everybody with all the questions that are coming in. We're closing in at the end of this webinar, but as Tai said, we will provide more information so that you can present those questions to Tai, and hopefully he'll have some follow-up information for you. We'll also be sending out the video and slides from this presentation, so you'll have that as an additional resource. But I really appreciate your time to come out and be a part of this webinar during your day. Hope that you continue to stay safe, be home, and we'll continue to talk to you. Hopefully you'll see you at another webinar. Thank you, Tai.
Thank you, everybody.